Morning. I'm Leila Abed, Acting Director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. Every 12 years, presidential elections in Mexico and the United States coincide, and the upcoming electoral cycles on both sides of the border will determine, in many ways, the future of the bilateral relationship. Ahead of Mexico's historic elections in June, the Mexico Institute launched a series of webinars on diverse topics. And today's virtual event will discuss one of the most pressing issues, the current state and the future of Mexico's democracy. Beginning in 1929, Mexico had 71 years of a single-party government under the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Mexico transitioned from a dominant party rule to a more democratic system in 2000, with the election of then PAN candidate Vicente Fox. Despite electing presidents from different parties since the transition, Mexico is one of the countries in Latin America with the largest decline in its support of democracy, registering a drop of 8% between 2020 and 2023, according to Latino Barometro's most recent report. This same report reveals that support for authoritarianism grew in Mexico from 22% to 33% in the last 3 years. In other words, just over a third support democracy, about a third is indifferent about the regime type, and the other third supports an authoritarian option. These indicators demonstrate that democracy in Mexico has deteriorated greatly since 2020. Democratic erosion in many ways is attributed to continuous attacks to journalists and the media, human rights defenders, civil society organizations, activists, feminists, and other groups within society that dissent or criticize Mexico's government. The absence of the rule of law and a predictable legal system, increasing corruption and intervention by organized crime, in addition to a weakening of political and personal freedoms and civil liberties, such as freedom of expression and privacy rights, have all served to diminish support for democracy. While Mexico became the U.S.'s top trading partner last year, and nearshoring has offered the country an extraordinary opportunity to attract foreign direct investment and with it stimulate its economy, it's difficult to imagine that Mexico will be able to reap both the economic and social benefits of this phenomenon if democracy continues to decline. These are some of the issues that our panelists will discuss this morning. Each speaker will present the findings and results of various reports published on Mexico's standing in the world. They will discuss areas in which Mexico has improved, others where it has seen no change, and areas in which it has worsened. But before I turn it over to our wonderful moderator, who everybody already knows, Ambassador Tony Wayne, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. We have simultaneous translation available for our viewers. On the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you should see an image of a globe. If you click on the globe, you can choose the language of your preference. Towards the end of the conversation, we will take questions from our audience if we have time. If you would like to submit a question to our panelists, please send them to our X account at Mexico Institute or to our email mexico@wilsoncenter.org. You can also type in your question on the Q&A box on the Zoom. Finally, I would like to take this time to thank our amazing group of speakers for joining us today to speak about Mexico's current state of democracy and where its political system is headed. And with that, I turn it over to you, Ambassador Wayne. Thank you so much for moderating today's event.
Thank you very much, Leila. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. As many in the audience know, Mexico is vital in many ways to the United States, and developments there have a direct impact on millions and millions of Americans. And one of those key issues or clusters of issues that we're going to talk about is democracy and governance. And it's very important that both in Mexico and in the United States, we place what's happening this year in the national election campaign in this broader perspective of comparing Mexico to other countries around the world and also looking historically at what's been going on. That's why we organize this conversation with representatives of some of the best studies that are being done about democracy and governance around the world, not just in Mexico and not just in the region. It's important to get that broader look at what's happening. Very sadly, the rankings and scores of Mexico in the area of democracy and governance have declined over the past decade. And it's very important to understand these trends because they go beyond any one leader or any one administration. And they're going to be important for Mexicans and for Mexico's partners, of which the United States is a major partner going forward. And whoever wins in June's national elections are going to have this really challenging agenda on democracy and governance, as well as a number of other issues related to that. And of course, this is going to affect not only the quality of Mexico's democracy, but its quality as a partner of the United States on economic issues, on security issues, on migration. So let's turn to our excellent speakers. We have with us Miguel Angel Lora Oatola, who is currently on the International Advisory Board of the Electoral Integrity Project, but who I had the pleasure of working with when he was working for the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. We're also going to hear from Michael Kopij, who works with the Varieties of Democracy Project, which is one of the major indexes that looks at the evolution of democracy around the world. We're going to hear from Alejandro Ponce, who helps lead the World Justice Project. We're going to hear from Ilan Bisberg, who is at the Colegio de Mexico and also works with the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, another one of the major global indexes looking at democracy. And then we're going to hear from Caitlin Watson, who works on our homegrown democracy index here in Washington Freedom House, which is, of course, not associated with any government also, just like the others, but produces a major report every year looking at the state of freedom in the world. So with that, let's move to our discussion, and let me invite Miguel Angel to start off with a short presentation of most recent findings.
Thank you, Tony, and hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. It's an honor to be here. I'll start sharing a PowerPoint presentation. I just put together 3 or 4 slides so that we get a sense of the data here. So if you can tell me when you can see it on screen, that would be great.
We have it. You might want to put it to the slide screen up above there with that looks like a little podium, and you can slide through them.
Okay, so you can see it, right?
We can see it.
Okay, great. So today I will start first with a quick definition of democracy, a definition which is, as democracy is, not limited to holding free and fair elections, but that goes beyond this. This will help in understanding the framework and the range of indicators that I will show you to measure the state of democracy in Mexico. I will then describe these indicators and show you the performance of these indicators today in Mexico, well, actually up until last year, and the performance over the last 5 years. So you understand the recent changes and declines that Mexico has been experiencing. So without further ado, first, I want to show you this framework, which is International Ideas, Global State of Democracy Indices and Initiative, and connected to this definition of democracy that I gave that goes beyond holding free and fair elections. Here, democracy has
different. Can you go to your next slide, Miguel Angel?
Oh, is it not showing?
And we can't really. You have to go to the next slide to show number 2, your second slide.
Okay, give me a second because I thought this was working. I'll share again. Because I did click on next.
It wouldn't be a PowerPoint presentation without something happening. So
yeah, of course.
So click on number 2.
I am clicking on next.
There it is. Okay, it's there.
It's there?
Yep.
So you're seeing like a box, a number of hexagons.
Global State of Democracy indices with your little clusters around them.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to say that democracy is not limited to the holding of elections. In fact, democracy has different components A majoritarian one, that means, rule by majority, but this needs to be controlled, because otherwise democracy can quickly become a tyranny. And a key control is having fundamental rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. And these rights in turn need to be guaranteed by the law, by the constitution, by the law. And this law, needs to be enforced and applied equally to everyone. So in sum, democracy is about free and fair elections, but also about fundamental rights and the rule of law. And as you can see here in this scheme, it's International Ideas Global State of Democracy Indices. They are a good measure for this, as they measure democracy through 4 attributes that you can see on screen. The first one is called representation, that has to do with having an elected government, periodical and credible elections, political parties that are, free to operate, free to register, free to campaign, inclusive suffrage, and an effective parliament that actually checks on executive power. Then you have a second component called rights or fundamental rights, which encompasses political and social rights. This includes civil liberties, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, as well as access to justice and basic welfare. Then we have the rule of law, that has to do with judicial independence, going from the Supreme Court all the way down to local tribunals. It also has to do with absence of corruption, personal integrity and security, and predictable enforcement. That means that the law is applied equally to everyone, and that it is predictable, and that citizens, but also public sector officials and the government, abide the law, follow the law. And last but not least, democracy also has to do with participation. And this is not only electoral participation every 3, 4, 5, 6 years, depending on the length of mandates in the country, but also participation through civil society. How dense, how rich is civil society, and of course, if it's allowed to happen in a country. So taking into account these different indicators, this wheel represents, and I hope you can see it, it's a wheel with...
Oh, you have to click on the 3rd slide.
I am clicking on it, but
On your
it's...
left, there it goes. Okay, now it'll come up. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, it's weird. I have to come out and then come in again, but it's fine. So taking these indicators that I just showed in the slide before, this is a snapshot of democracy in Mexico up to 2023. And, it has different colors because basically the way International IDEA measures the state of democracy goes from 0 to 1, 1 being the highest, 0 being the lowest. And, that can be divided into 3. So indicators have a score of above 0.7. High performing indicators are colored in green, which is inclusive suffrage, elected government, freedom of movement, and freedom of religion. Then those indicators that have a medium performance between 0.4 and 0.7 are colored in yellow. And as you can see, most of the indicators in Mexico are colored in yellow. And then finally, those indicators that have a low performance under 0.4 or under actually 0.39 are colored in red, which in this case is access to justice. For Mexico to give an assessment overall, its strong point is representative government. And, that is illustrated by holding periodical, authentic, competitive elections where everyone can vote, having a government that is elected rather than, a military government or a monarchy, and, the strength of its local and national elections. At the same time, it's, out of the 4 components, its weakest is the rule of law that has to do with, as mentioned, judicial independence, the predictable enforcement of laws, absence of corruption, and personal integrity and security. And to give you, let me change slides in this weird way.
It's changed. It's done.
Okay, great. Thank you. And this last slide is about the performance of democracy in Mexico in the last 5 years. We have a total of 22 indicators. And as you can see here, colored in red, there's been declines in 12 out of those 22 indicators. So effective parliament, local democracy, freedom of association, freedom of expression, basic welfare, gender equality, predictable enforcement, judicial independence. Anyways, All the indicators that are here colored in red are indicators that have experienced declines in the last 5 years. And there you can see the scores for 2018 and the scores for 2023. At the same time, there's been 3 indicators with advances: freedom of movement, freedom of religion, and absence of corruption. And, and those are colored in green. And there's been no change, or no statistically significant change, to be more precise, in 7 indicators. And those are the ones labeled in, well, colored in yellow. Here, I would just want to highlight that the biggest declines are found in effective parliament, which denotes the extent to which the legislature, Congress, can oversee the executive. Then freedom of expression, which entails freedom of discussion, academic freedom, cultural freedom. Freedom of the press, which measures, amongst others, censorship from the government, if there's bias in the media, if there's harassment to journalists. Then we have, amongst the biggest decliners, judicial independence, which means that the courts, and as I said, from the Supreme Court to local tribunals, are not subject to undue influence from the government or from the powerful, actually. And civil society, which measure if participation through civil society organizations is possible, if there's support to do that, and also if there's freedom for civil society organizations to exist and to operate. And with this, I close my opening participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguel Angel. Now let me invite Michael Kopidej to share some observations about the VDEM look at Mexico.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Wayne. I think, and I think I'm going to agree a lot with what Miguel Angel just shared. Not surprisingly, because the Global State of Democracy Index is based heavily on VDEM data. But I think it's important not to reduce democracy to just one or two things. It's a temptation to do that. I've had friends, for example, state that it's impossible to consider the United States a democracy because money from billionaires and secretive PACs plays such an important role in our electoral politics. And so it's also reasonable to ask how Mexico could have a mediocre rating on these indices when it has held national elections every 3 years since the 1920s, and no president is ever reelected. And the National Electoral Institute has actually a more professional administrative capacity than the rather amateurish, although honest, county level election administrators in the United States. But in reality, democracy consists of dozens and dozens of different elements. And VDEM, for example, measures 35 different attributes in the Electoral Democracy Index, and I think 27, 29 more in the liberal component, which combines to make liberal democracy. So really, democracy isn't reducible to just one criterion. It's many institutions and processes that have to work together to protect wide access to information, freedom to organize and discuss, a level playing field for party competition, honest administration of elections, effective constitutional guarantees of individual and political rights and freedoms, and legislative and judicial checks on checks and balances to hold the executive accountable in between elections. So all these things have to go together, and deficiencies in any of these areas can be harmful, but they're often compensated by strengths in other areas. So as this applies to Mexico, according to most of our high-level indices, Mexican democracy peaked in 2005 and is at lower levels now. In 2005, the Electoral Democracy Index was at 0.71 on a 0 to 1 scale, and it's at 0.53 now. Liberal democracy was at 0.51 because liberal democracy is a higher standard for democracy than electoral democracy, but it's now at 0.3, so it's a pretty substantial decline on that measure. But I'm gonna make comparisons from 2018 to 23, much as Miguel Angel did. because the Vidam Institute says that the current episode of autocratization in Mexico began in 2019. So I'll start at the year before that, which also happens to be the first year of the AMLO government. And in that regard, you know, I'm not going to talk more about the really high level indices, because I think we can learn a lot more by looking at the most specific indicators that we've got in the system. And in that regard, and I think a lot of people have said this and will echo it as we continue, the areas in which democracy was working rather well in Mexico in 2018, but has declined, are three things. One is compliance of the executive with the high court, academic freedom, and the autonomy and capacity of the INE, the electoral management body. Those are three things that have declined. And there have been declines in some other areas as well, but there are areas in which Mexico wasn't as democratic to start with. It was just at kind of medium levels in government censorship effort, executive oversight by the legislature, and media self-censorship. There's also been a little bit of decline in respect for counter-arguments, which is an aspect of deliberative democracy. So there's some declines in that regard. But there are other areas in which a few things have actually improved since 2018. We've actually seen a significant but small decline in levels of political corruption, according to our index. And we've seen some improvements in aspects of participatory democracy. So the direct popular vote index has improved pretty dramatically, and the popular initiative index, like the ability of people to put issues on the ballot for referendums. There's some other aspects of democracy that are not part of our core indices, but there are other things that we measure that may be considered relevant. Some things that were sort of at medium levels, but have gotten a little worse. Government attacks on the judiciary have increased. The government's dissemination of false information to domestic audiences, party dissemination of false information abroad, providing reasoned justifications for policies, and this, I'm not sure I completely understand this, but like a loss or some deterioration of the government's ability to shut down the internet. That's something that's used in our digital society index. And there's also some decline in some worsening of the fractionalization of the online media. That is, things are more polarized. People tend to be living in different worlds rather than sharing a common reality. The government has been monitoring social media a little bit more, and there's a little more concentration of party control at the subnational level. So, like maybe a decline in alternate power centers, like control of regional or local governments by opposition parties. So it's not it's not just one thing, and it's not like everything has declined across the board. There's certain areas in which some aspects of democracy have taken a turn for the worse, while some others have improved. But the net effect is a small but significant decline in levels of both liberal and electoral democracy in Mexico in the past 6 years. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'd like to invite Alejandro to talk about his work with the World Justice Project, which understandably will look quite a bit at rule of law and justice systems.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. So let me share some of the insights from the rule of law index. First of all, so I'm going to present a slightly different alternative from what just my colleagues have talked about, So I'm going to talk about the rule of law, and just very basically, just the way to understand the rule of law is is this principle in which both authorities and citizens are bound by law, right? In which they comply, enforce. I mean, the law is enforced, applied, and so on, just subject to certain principles and subject to fundamental rights. And the framework that we have to do, because the law is so extensive, is through these 8 factors or indicators that essentially summarize this idea. The first 4, just whether indeed the authorities are bound by law and there exists an institutional framework and legal framework to provide incentives, the capacity, and so on for doing this. And the second is whether citizens indeed are bound by law, and when there are disputes or problems, there are justice mechanisms to indeed solve disputes and provide redress. So that's the basic framework that we have. So these are 8 pillars that we essentially in the index that we produce subdivide in 44 indicators. Each one of these indicators are outcome indicators. So for example, when we talk about open government, we talk about publicized laws, right to information, both passive and active, civic participation, compliant mechanisms. And the way in which we operationalize this is through looking at how the people just perceive all these issues. So we use 2 sources of information. So a general population poll that we conduct every few years in all the different countries that we measure, 143 countries. And then every year we interview attorneys in civil law, criminal law, labor law, and some public health practitioners. The idea is to ask them about day-to-day situations that they may face, just whether their perceptions about corruptions, or just how the justice system operates, or just how the checks and balances in a country operate. So then we collect all this information. So we have about 500 variables that we map, just validate, and use to produce the scores between 0 and 1 for all the 44 indicators that we publish every year. So let me just go to the latest results that we have for Latin America, similar to what my colleagues have said. What we find is Mexico, when we compare it with the rest of Latin American countries, Mexico is actually at the close to the bottom just in Latin America. So Mexico is not really performing on par with other countries with similar income levels. I mean, even just Brazil, Argentina, but it's closer to some of the weakest countries in the region. And this is something that we have seen over several years. So this is the aggregated score just between 0 and 1. Then when we start looking at some of the specifics, we see the overall score for Mexico is 0.42, ranks, as I was saying, 27 over 32, and even globally, 116 over 142. We saw a slight decline over the previous year. And I'll go into each one of the components, which is the most interesting part. But when we look at this, the overall score just over the years, and this is the growth rate year by year, we have seen a constant decline over the last 5 years in the rule of law score, which measures all these different aspects. So going into the specific components, we see 4 big challenges that the country is facing and that the new government is going to be facing. And I will put them in 4 buckets. So the first one has to do with this idea of constraints on government powers, checks and balances, fundamental rights, some of the core elements that we have been talking about. So where the country ranks 104 out of 142. The second one is this idea of absence of corruption, open government, just really this idea of patrimonialism, just in which just the people or public officials use the office for private gain, and whether exist elements just to counteract this through open government. And this is particularly in the area of absence of corruption, when Mexico scores quite low, actually, just as compared to the world and the region. Open government is an area that doesn't score as low, but it's still just this open governance or this participation and transparency is not really reflected in better corruption scores. Security is a big challenge. Mexico scores 133 out of 144, and justice also Mexico scores at the bottom. Going into each one of these specific components, checks and balances, legislative oversight, judiciary, independent auditing, non-governmental checks. in most of them, just except for elections, the lawful transition of power, in most of them, just Mexico scores lower than the region or even just upper middle income countries. And when we look at fundamental rights, fundamental freedoms that include just a variety of just civil and political freedoms, again, Mexico just scores below. And when we look at the trajectory over time, even though the change is not as pronounced, just we see just that over the years, particularly on fundamental rights over the last few years, the scores have been declining. Moving to the second area, corruption. Corruption, again, is an area just where Mexico just scores well below just countries just of similar income levels. And again, just open government, just right to information. We know just that there are some institutions that are performing quite well just in that regard, but many of these initiatives have not really just translated into less corruption. When we look at the trends, just the first years we saw a decline. The last 2 years we saw a slight improvement, but mainly just an stagnation. Order and security, we know that this is a big concern. Just Mexico scores almost at the bottom just of countries. Here we measure both crime as well as homicides, or measured by conflict, as well as the use of violence to solve problems. And this is a large problem in Mexico. We have seen a deterioration over the previous years in this area. And finally, justice, both just access to justice, civil justice, just the justice just for the people to resolve their problems. And we see problems of accessibility, delays. Just probably one area in which we see that Mexico is performing much better is in the use of alternative mechanisms, both in civil and criminal justice. But in criminal justice, this is another area in which just effectively the country is not performing as well. Effective investigation, timely and effective adjudication, corruption. These are problems that still prevent the criminal justice system for effectively delivering justice. And this is, again, just even though in the last few years we haven't seen just as much of a decline in civil justice, we have seen it just in the first years, and we have seen a decline in criminal justice. Finally, just to conclude, just we have, on top of these global scores, we have produced a sub-national index in Mexico in each one of the states using the same methodology, and just some insights. First, it's not homogeneous, the country. There are just states just that perform better than others, and there is significant variation across the states. And second, just when we look at some of the findings, some of these are very similar to what we find at the national level. Civic space has contracted, stagnation in absence of corruption, perception of security improved, but really homicides are still quite high. Alternative justice mechanisms performing better, just the issue of criminal justice, effective public prosecution and investigation, big challenges. And this is something that we see in all the different states. But something that it's important is just that despite this stagnation, there are some states that have made improvements since 2018. So some states, Querétaro, Guanajuato, Sinaloa, Baja California Sur, Tamaulipas, and Sonora have shown actually some improvements over the years, which shows actually that progress is possible and is happening just across the country. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, and thank you for flagging that you have this more in-depth ability to go in and look at Mexico state by state also. That takes a lot of work, I know, but very useful. Now we're going to look a little bit at the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, and Ilan Pietzberg, please share some of your thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. In fact, I agree with all what has been said with respect of the indexes that democracy has been being lower and lower the last years. But well, I want to talk mainly about qualitative data. Mexico has never been a consolidated democracy, if that exists anywhere. There was a transition from an hegemonic party, the PRI, to a presidency of the PAN with Fox in the year 2000. But all along these years, there have been countless accusations of clientelism of various parties, especially the mass parties such as the PRI, the PRD, and more recently Morena. There has been violence against candidates and pressure on voters, especially at the local level, that has persisted, although there was a democratic transition, buying votes, carrying voters to manifest for candidates, and going bringing them to the vote booths on the day of elections. What changed significantly since the 90s is that the INE, the electoral institution, and the TRIFE, the electoral tribunal, demonstrated remarkable resilience and activity. They were structured and autonomous enough to count the votes and sanction the elections, making fraud at the national and state level highly improbable or even basically impossible. They were solidly consolidated as the guardians of the elections. The division of power in the Mexican state increased significantly since the year 2000, as the PAN did not have the majority of the two chambers from the year 2000 to 2012. When the PRI regained the presidency in 2012, they had no majority either. Since then, we had a divided government, as it was called. Despite the success of the 1995 reform in making the Supreme Court an independent body of the executive, the judicial power has been plagued by corruption. The National Attorney General, in particular, remained and remains until now a figure who is not independent of the presidency, indicating a pressing need for further reform. The presidency, the federal government, and more decidedly the state and local governments have intervened in the elections since the year 2000, or before, obviously, probably tilting some results since after the transition in the year 2000. This, despite the presence of the INE and the TRIFE. No. Okay, what has changed in the last years and the present presidency of Morena in this context? Before Morena, 6 years after the transition, the war against drugs began, increasing violence against candidates and implying that in growing parts of the country, the voting booths could not be installed. The illegal organizations become a non-democratic actors in the elections. In the present administration, Morena, the party of the government, has had an absolute majority during the first 3 years of the AMLO administration, which allowed it to change the constitution with the aid of its satellite parties, the Green Party and the PT, and relative majority during the last 3 years, which did not allow it to change the constitution. So we had again a situation such as the one of the pre-years of a hegemonic party. AMLO concentrated power enormously. He centralized all the decisions, including what investments to make, Maya Train, the Dos Bocas refinery, the cancellation of the new airport in Mexico City, the construction of the alternative airport on an army base, the airport in Tulum, etc. As he could not control the autonomous institutions, the government of AMLO, the IFE and the TRIFE, and the INAI, Transparency Institution, he has tried to weaken them and has achieved so to a certain degree. For example, nowadays, campaign begin much earlier, campaign expenses are not controlled, and the intervention of government officials, governors, and the president himself are currently not sanctioned. The judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, has been the only autonomous and independent power able to counter the executive. It has declared some laws passed by the parliament unconstitutional. The government intends to modify the way of electing the Supreme Court and its composition, but has yet to have a majority to pass it. The government of AMLO has not only not taken the army out of the streets in its fight against the criminal gangs, but has empowered it greatly. They intervene in most of the great construction project of the present government, and they administer the customs office, the airports, the Mayan train, the borders. They have become a real economic power, which they were never before. They are the one of the country leading forces still under the control of the presidency, but this may change in the future. So this explains why I believe Mexican democracy and the governability of the Mexican state have been weakened in the last few years. As you all know, this is not a fact that affects only Mexico, but it's many countries worldwide, including the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Caitlin, let me invite you to share some of your perspectives from the annual Freedom House reports that you all put out, looking at the world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Wayne. So I wanted to begin a little bit by going through some of the Freedom House, Freedom in the World methodology very briefly to give a sense of sort of how we come up with our rankings of countries nationwide. So Freedom in the World is an annual global assessment of political rights and civil liberties. Across the globe, it's been ongoing for more than 50 years. And today, the report assesses 195 countries and 15 territories. And analysts use sort of a set of 25 different indicators to assess political rights and civil liberties. And although over the years we've tweaked them, refined those indicators, for the most part, there's been an effort to maintain those relatively stable to allow for sort of a look across the years to make sure that we can offer a robust analysis over the years within countries and across countries. It's also important to note that the Freedom in the World report really emphasizes the real world exercise of political rights and civil liberties of individuals and citizens on the ground. So that's to say that while, of course, the report accounts for policies and legal mechanisms, legal frameworks in the assessment, the emphasis is placed on the implementation of those policies and mechanisms. So the way that citizens are really experiencing their rights and liberties on a day-to-day basis. The report categorizes countries as free, partly free, or not free. And this year, Mexico ranked 60 out of 100 points on those 25 indicators measuring political rights and civil liberties. And that places it in the partly free category. And on the Freedom House report, the partly free category really encompasses quite a wide range of scenarios for rights and democracy. In Mexico's case, as we've discussed, we see a relatively long-standing electoral democracy with consistent and peaceful shifts and transitions of power and transitions between parties on a relatively regular basis. And yet, it's an electoral democracy with significant challenges that impede the full exercise of political rights and civil liberties. We can see that actually, although its overall score this year has not changed over last year, and in fact, it's maintained the same score on our index for the past 3 years. This year in particular, it did see 2 score changes, which essentially neutralized each other. One, an improvement on our indicator for social freedoms due to, and thanks to a September Supreme Court ruling that essentially decriminalized abortion nationwide, and then a decline on our indicator that measures freedom of movement. And that decline was in response to an observation over several years of sort of a pattern of increasing organized crime and violence, inhibiting movement of citizens across the country, especially in certain pockets of the country, and in rural areas and between major cities. We can see here that Mexico's score has declined gradually and steadily over the past decade. So this aligns with many of the indices we've already talked about today. Mexico declined from being a free to a partly free country actually in 2011 and has sort of been on a steady decline since then. And our report this year and together with the reports from the last 10 years, really, if we look at them as a whole, highlight 3 main areas that have contributed to this steady decline. First, as I think has been mentioned several times, organized crime and violence is a significant catalyst for Mexico's decline. Violence has impeded internal movement, as I mentioned, and at least 19 candidates have been murdered just in the lead up to these coming elections. So that is telling of the level of violence and how it impacts sort of electoral integrity and the electoral process. And Mexico, of course, remains one of the most dangerous places to be a journalist, a human rights defender, especially an indigenous or environmental rights defender. Organized crime and violence has, of course, implications for corruption and transparency, as many of my fellow panelists have noted. Mexico, in fact, has quite a robust anti-corruption framework. However, the implementation is often weak. Our reports have noted over the last several years the use by Sedena as the Secretariat of National Defense of this Pegasus spyware to surveil human rights defenders and in some cases citizens as sort of a breach of transparency and privacy freedoms. And finally, of course, both crime, organized crime, and corruption and transparency have adverse implications for the rule of law. As also my fellow panelists have mentioned, efforts to prosecute folks involved in corruption and organized crime often stall or do not end up in convictions, and investigations that involved allies of the government or even institutions that are favored by the government are often perfunctory or rare. And so before I finish up, I also just wanted to note one additional Freedom House initiative. It's a separate index from Freedom of the World, but related and relatively new to Freedom House, the Election Watch for a Digital Age, and Mexico's report was just published recently. This project is a new initiative that looks at sort of the intersection between the digital space and elections and democracy and human rights. So it especially focuses on areas to watch, especially in the digital space, that might have implications for the electoral integrity of countries having elections in a given year. So our Mexico report here, I won't go into too much detail. I encourage folks to check it out. But does highlight the manipulation of information online that has, where online content has been manipulated to make false claims about various candidates, harassment and violence, which I already mentioned, making this rather a violent pre-electoral period. And then the threat of criminal or civil lawsuits, which has encouraged self-censorship, also inhibits critical reporting in some cases. And then finally, content remover, where both state and non-state actors actually either use threats or other mechanisms to pressure social media organizations and individuals to remove content that they might find distasteful or not in their favor. And with that, I will end. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Right. Thank you, Caitlin. And it's very that I'm going to take a look at your new report. I haven't looked at that yet, but we've just had a very egregious case in Mexico of exactly what you were talking about, using social media and other press conferences to particularly go after a respected non-governmental organization in a very destructive and detrimental way. So let's look a little bit. We have these elections coming up. The elections are taking place at a national level. As was mentioned, we have criminal violence going on. We have these campaigns with a number of questions about the campaigns. We also have a number of proposals by the incumbent president that he hopes to get a supermajority for, to get constitutional changes that, at least in my reading, would further weaken the processes and institutions of democracy. And I'm just wondering, and the idea would be that if they get a 2/3 majority in the congressional elections, that you would see these proposals go forward. I'm wondering if any of your organizations have taken a look at these proposals, and this is, of course, using electoral democracy and the mechanisms of democracy to bring about change that, in fact, might undermine democracy. So I invite some comments about that. And I see that Miguel Angel, you have your hand up first, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize that this trajectory of declining in a number of indicators might continue in light of these proposals. And to illustrate this, I'll just focus on two. One that is called Plan B, that consisted basically in weakening the country's National Electoral Institute. As rightly pointed out, this proposal didn't go through because the ruling party did not have a 2/3 majority in Congress. However, a legal proposal was approved and then was stopped by the Supreme Court. And this is one thing that I want you to keep in mind, because the end of my answer to this will deal with the Supreme Court and its composition coming up. And a second proposal has to do with the Supreme Court and with other judges and magistrate positions in the country. There's a reform that aims to replace the system by which they are elected through changing that to popular election. But as you always know and say, the devil lies in the detail, and this popular election of judges and justices and magistrates would make them very susceptible to political pressures. It will force them to campaign and to ask for support from political parties, specifically from the ruling party, further weakening their independence. And this again needs a constitutional majority in Congress to pass, which the ruling party does not have, and it's likely that it won't get in the next election. However, and as I said before, we have to look at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has so far stopped a number of initiatives, these two that I mentioned, but also another initiative to militarize fully the National Guard, which is a civilian, in spirit and origin, police force. And it has stopped them because these laws have been either violating the legislative process or violating, are being ruled unconstitutional. For the Supreme Court to rule a law as unconstitutional, it needs a majority of 8 out of the 11 justices or ministers. There's a change in one of the ministers in November, I think the 1st of November. And the way the justices are appointed is that the president submits a list of 3 to the Senate. If the Senate doesn't like the list of 3, then the president sends another list. And then if that is then rejected by the Senate, the president can direct appoint someone to the Supreme Court. The president has already done this a few months ago. A new Supreme Court justice that has been very criticized because of her close alignment to the president, of following his agenda. So if this happens in November, the new president will be able, to appoint a minister, a justice that will do their bidding, that will act as a delegate. And if that happens, this majority of 8 out of 11 ministers that you need to stop unconstitutional reforms would break, and then proposals such as Plan B that weakens National Electoral Institute, the other proposal with the judiciary branch that limits their independence, and the militarization of the National Guard would effectively happen. So, yeah, that's it.
Thank
for
you
now.
for
Thank
sharing
you.
that. Any other thoughts from anyone on this? Well, let me ask a related question then. And I know that VDEM looked at this a couple of years ago. What are the factors that have been most effective in helping societies resist the decline in democracy and democratic practices? There have been some cases around the world where there's been a reversal, right? And people have at least held firm. In some places, they pushed back. So what are those factors, and what should we look for or hope for in Mexico in that sense?
Well, I guess I will address that. And I'm not speaking for the work of the episodes of a transition project that happens in Gothenburg, but from other research I've done with VDEM data. And what I'm finding, like looking at a huge sample of almost all countries for almost 100 years, and what predicts upturns and downturns in democracy. What it seems to me like is that there are 3 sorts of actors or institutions that serve as a kind of protective belt for democracy, that help restore an equilibrium that's there. And those 3 things are the rule of law, institutionalized political parties, and a vibrant civil society. So if you have those 3 things in place, then they tend to resist incursions by non-democratic actors or people who might want to lead a coup attempt or things like that. And they also tend to reinforce each other, so that if there are attacks on the rule of law, then political parties could step in through the legislature to strengthen it, or civil society organizations could lead protests for that. If there are attacks on civil society organizations, then political parties could become their defenders, and the courts could also protect the rights of organizations. So those 3 institutions tend to reinforce whatever level of democracy is there. Now, this is not necessarily always a good thing. Of course, it is a good thing if a country is highly democratic and the rule of law and civil society and political parties are all champions of democracy. That helps stabilize a regime. But if a country is not very democratic, then it's probably also likely that the parties and the courts and civil society are kind of weak, and they're not in a position to promote greater democracy. In fact, they might tend to stabilize the lack of democracy that's in the system to begin with. Those are my kind of superficial conclusions about studying this.
No, I think you've identified 3 key institutions. And I remember one of the most hopeful things when I was ambassador in Mexico was the arrival and evolution of civil society organizations in that country, and a gradual effort by the Supreme Court to actually be more independent over time. Ilan, please, and then I'll ask Caitlin and Alejandro to make some final statements too.
Yeah, well, yeah, the big problem of Mexico is violence. No, the army has become a very important economic, it may be a political factor, and that's because there is so much violence in Mexico. And then violence is a big power in order to reduce democracy, in many cases, So it's a way we can see in Salvador, in Ecuador, how governments have been acting in a context, in a very violent context, social movements, which has been defined as by Michael Kopech as a very important factor, have a lot of trouble acting in a violent context. So I'm very pessimistic about the situation of Mexico. What can stop this the democratic evolution?
Thank you very much. So maybe Caitlin and then Alejandro, please.
Sure, thank you. And I mean, I agree with everything that's been said so far. I would re-emphasize the power of civil society and sort of social movements as a really key element. I think Mexico has an interesting context for that. As we can see, just in February, the protests against the proposal put forth by AMLO were robust, and Mexico, I think, has a strong history of social movements and protests really coming out and seeking to defend democracy or whatever it is their cause, and have generally been received sort of without violent repression and allowed to flourish. Having said that, of course, as has been mentioned, the increasing violence and the organized crime that inhibits freedom of movement also inhibits sort of robust reporting, and is going to make it increasingly more difficult if it continues down this path for civil society and human rights defenders to continue to do their work. So I think on the one hand, that's an area of strength for Mexico, but also an area to watch as these factors that we've all discussed today can continue to decline, if they continue to decline.
Thank you. Alejandro.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add to the previous question, when we have analyzed some of the data just from around the world, we have seen just obviously there are institutional checks that help support democracy and the rule of law. And one of the most important ones that we have seen when there are big changes, obviously, is when there are changes in government, right? And one of the probably the big challenges that Mexico has is that Mexico has a lot of challenges. Just we have talked about violence, we have talked about justice, and one of the great paradoxes that we're seeing is just in spite of these challenges, still the government is quite popular. So it's very hard indeed. We cannot simply talk about changing democracy, just the institutions that are supporting democracy, but it's really just up to the public, to the people as well, just to demand of changes. And this is something that we haven't seen as much recently in Mexico, just in spite of all the different challenges that we will think that will just encourage people to demand that change. Just on the contrary, it's just like there's some apathy just to a certain extent, or some normalization of some of the situation that indeed makes overcoming these challenges much more difficult. So I think it's up to all the Mexican people to realize that, I mean, it's not only about the institutions, but also it's about just particularly in the face of these coming elections, I mean, to effectively just exercise that voice.
Alejandro, thank you for that reminder. And that does remind me of that recent Pew survey, which found the largest increase in the countries that they surveyed in those favoring authoritarian decision-making was in Mexico. So I think that reflects that apathy also. Let's let this person decide things. But it's right. Democracy doesn't survive if people don't pay attention. So let's hope they do. And thank you all for the excellent work here today, but of your colleagues also in studying the countries around the world, the trends around the world, and helping spread that knowledge and helping spread the factors that are very key for the survival of democracy. So many thanks to each of you for participating, and thanks to our audience for being with us today. And we'll look forward to having more interaction with you on these issues as we get to the elections in Mexico and then the post-election developments that happen. So thanks to everybody for joining, and have a wonderful day.